Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Raising the Visibility. I am your host, Carl Evans, CEO of the Hope for Us Network. And it is my pleasure for you to join us tonight. Hello, and welcome, everyone, to this very special episode of Raising the Visibility. I am your host, Carl Evans, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to this episode dedicated to mental health and violence in America. This was not one of our originally scheduled episodes for season 1 of Raising the Visibility, but we felt compelled to add it in. We're always talking about different intersections within mental health in our communities, and talking about violence in a broad concept is not something we're strangers to. But given recent news events around mass shootings and violence, we thought it was prescient to bump up the schedule a little bit. And today we're going to be diving in to this topic sort of just head first. If you watched with us last week, we touched on it a little bit in our episode built around the concepts of talking about orientation. We talked about it a little bit in terms of talking about violence, but tonight we're dedicating this episode. And as always, a little bit of a sort of context for all of you. You know, one of the things that we talk about with a lot of the mental health conversations we have is that we don't want to be stat heavy. Stats are important, and it's a good way to make sure you're staying accurate. But a lot of the times when we talk about this idea of transforming our mental health structures and becoming proactive, giving people numbers, your eyes can just sort of glaze over. So it's important for us to also make sure that we're keeping a context that keeps the human element in check. The proactive vision is not just about we need to educate individuals and get people to sort of break out of their silences. We also need to reform, transform, and enhance our community spaces and our institutions to principally affect change that can be sustainable and lasting. And that's part of our transformation triangle. This conversation is just as much a part of that as talking about other things like services or destigmatizing certain types of illnesses and trauma discussions. And raising the visibility, as we talked about before, overall, we've been talking about stigmas in our institutions. So this conversation kind of fits right in there. If you have had the privilege of joining us these past couple of weeks, our very first episode was around body image, and our second episode was around how age can play into generating stigmas and bias in our institutions. If you joined us last week, we had one talking about sexual orientation. We were going to take a hiatus or a little break this week, and next week on June 9th, we're going to be coming back talking about gender identity and bias and institutional biases. But today, obviously, we felt it was important to keep the conversations going that have unfortunately been pushed up to the forefront with the recent most visible acts of mass violence in our country. On June 16th, we'll be again coming back and we'll be talking about ethnicity and bias in our institutions. In closing out season 1, we'll be focused on talking about the financial intersection. And all of these topics kind of play into what we're talking about today. When we talk about violence in America, we didn't want to just title the episode talking about guns and gun reform because that's relevant here, but that's not necessarily, with any topic we talk about mental health, we can never get it all done in one day. You're never going to get every piece of a topic done. And it's irresponsible to try and just rush through large topics and just hit the surface level. So we're always taking small bites, and that's the whole point of raising the visibility. And this platform is to try to really get substantive conversations going, understanding that we're only going to be able to touch on a few elements, but that way we can really tease them out and really talk through them. Talking about this topic right now, stat heavy. We don't want to be too stat heavy, but here's some familiar numbers that unfortunately have probably been hammering a lot of you on your social media, in your feeds, and just in TV. Mass shootings and the general stats around mass shootings. Because there's no universal definition in America for what constitutes a mass shooting, The FBI has a definition that talks about 4 or more people in a sort of singular incident or contained incident. There's other definitions that specify who the person doing the shooting is, describing them as a certain type of individual. So you could see people say that there have been X amount of mass shootings as small as 3, as high as 260. You see this graphic sort of accounts for all of that. But I think it's safe to say that when we got to Uvalde last week, it was charting as either the 230th or 268th mass shooting in America. And we do know that there have been more than 1,000 individuals injured and more than 300 killed in any incident in which there have been multiple persons injured or wounded by gun violence. And you've probably been hammered with these numbers just as much as the victim tabulations from the actual incidents. And these numbers can kind of dismiss the fact that these are real human lives, and not just the individuals who are victims and the loss of their lives, but if you enumerate the families, the parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, community members who are connected to that individual life, you know, these numbers can kind of undermine or belittle the severe gravity and impact that this loss of life has on our communities and the psychological injuries that it produces. And, you know, I think about that because as we're coming into this discussion, there's other numbers that might seem to be not familiar. I was shocked and amazed that even if, as I look today, since not more than a week ago in the massacre in Texas, there have been 18 more classified mass shootings. Just 18 more, just over the past couple of days. 14 mass shootings over the Memorial Day weekend. And another stat that kind of snuck by us, we're in mental health and we focus a lot on suicide prevention. So you're aware of certain kind of stats, but I was actually surprised to learn that as of 2020, the CDC has registered that gun violence is the leading cause of death among youth. And inside of that statistic, and youth being ages sort of 1 to 20 years old, and inside of that statistic of 4,000 individuals who have died by gun violence since 2020, 30% of them were deemed death by suicide with a gun. So you've probably always seen through all this chatter and all this talk around the massacres and around this extremely visible levels of violence, mental health. Mental health has come into the discussion because folks are talking about how do we stop the violence, and guns are obviously the target. And there's obviously resistance to gun reforms, changes, and regulations. And as opposed to talking about the merits of reform and regulations, one of the most common features that we see, unfortunately, in the persistent repeating, tragedy of mass violence by guns is to talk about mental illness, that it's really about mental health. Now, that can be frustrating just on the face of there's a severe lack of underserved, underfunded institutions and services and supports in mental health across the board, across the country, in city, state, county, take your pick. So it seems kind of galling to then talk about mental health as a knee-jerk reaction to mass violence, as if it's the only time. It doesn't feel credible because, talk to mental health professionals, advocates, nonprofits such as ourselves, and half of our work is trying to get people to normalize and prioritize mental health. So, but just on the face of it, somebody says, well, it's a mental health issue in America when we talk about massive gun violence, and that logic doesn't pan out. Prevalences of mental illnesses, diagnosable mental illnesses in America, charts about consistent with any other number of nations that can fit certain economic and social structures that we have. These are countries that have similar prevalency for mental illness diagnosis, okay? And there, in a lot of cases, are nations that have gun ownership to some degree. So it's not like guns don't exist or there's some total ban on guns. But when it comes to the level of gun violence, and this is one of any number of statistics or graphics you could find, America just outpaces every other sort of comparable data point in terms of gun violence. And this graphic is just a sort of way of driving home the fact that it's a complete, distraction or distortion to say that the correlation with high levels of gun violence is due to high levels of mental illness, diagnosed mental illness in this country. It's actually offensive. And this is where we're going to sort of spend a little bit of time today, because let's talk about mental health and violence. The fact is that this data comes from us from the North American, the National Alliance of Mental Health, NAMI, and through their research and collected data, it's shown that consistently less than 5% of violent acts are linked to mental illness. And this is also backed up by the CDC. This is data that's backed up when you look in state to state research. Less than 5% of violent acts are consistently linked to mental illnesses. Moreover, it's generally understood through research that people with mental illnesses are as much as 3 times as likely to be victims of crime, including abuse and murder. And again, there's various forms of research that reaffirm that at state and city levels as well as this national research. And just as a sort of underscore on that, mentally ill people appear to be, through research, commit far fewer violent crimes than people without any form of diagnosed or recognized psychological disturbance. And there's this big myth that's perpetuated about the correlation between violence and mental health. And it's not just a resistance to gun reform. That's certainly a primary place, but it's also used in a sort of pop culture and media way. I think we're all familiar with the sort of cartoonish illustrations that the crazy person and can be violent and unpredictable. One of the things we're going to be talking about today is understanding that mental health as illnesses and trauma cannot be scapegoats for talking about mass violence in America. Mental health care and caring for the health of our minds is part of a solution to trying to reduce violence and impact. But one thing we want to set straight right out the gate is that the results of mass violence and mass shooting is not a pandemic of mental illness gone awry. And sort of closing out to that point, we also want to make clear that when we talk about violence in America, we can see that mental health isn't the primary cause of this mass violence situation, because there are other realms or forms of violence that come through policy. And that'll correlate in terms of talking about finding solutions to reduce harm and potential harm and find ways to create safety nets that help people resist or identify people who might be individuals who could be at risk of causing mass harm. We're going to talk about gun reform, but it should be noted that violence doesn't just have to be through a gun. Creating policies that deny access to shelter and food is a form of violence on the human condition, which is relevant in terms of when we talk about reforming ourselves and improving our community spaces. If we start to humanize that policies have a direct impact, we start to think about things like shelter and sustenance. We understand that access to healthcare. If you look at policies that deny basic human rights like body autonomy, reject the reality of identity and orientation to validate these parts of the human existence. If we look at all these three different, these sorts of conditions and think of them as the quality of human life, what we begin to realize is that the discussion about violence in America is not just needed to rely on the stats of mass shootings and the amount of guns owned and things like that. We can create an attitude and understanding that there has to be some sort of agreement or some sort of discussion about what is it we're willing to risk to continue to brutalize and put individuals at harm for the privilege of individuals X, Y, and Z to maintain ownership of certain tools that don't just have the opportunity to be used for sport, but can also create mass harm to individuals who had no issue being a part of that. The humanization of this conversation is something that might get a little abstract, but it's a one-to-one correlation. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is not having a debate about if we should be doing something in terms of mass violence, particularly linked to guns in America. Today, we're going to be talking about what are things that are realistic, and that's going to include the very direct topic of talking about gun reform, but there also needs to be a discussion about what is it that we can be providing in our community in terms of resources to help build up safety nets that keep people from getting to a space of dehumanizing their fellow person and wanting to act out in violent ways. So we're going to be bringing on our panel right away today and get this conversation going. It's my honor to introduce this group who's joining us today. They're coming from a lot of wonderful different spaces and intersections on the conversation. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring everyone on, and then they're going to introduce themselves, and we're just going to jump right into things. So first, let me get folks on camera. Mary, can we see you? Can we hear you?
Yes. Hi.
Thank you for joining us, Mary. I said thanks you.
Sure.
Next up, Chelsea, can we see you? Can we hear you?
Hi.
Thank you for joining us, Chelsea. Pete, Mr. Peter, can we see you? Can we hear you? Thank you for joining us. Angelica, coming in clear. Can we hear you? Can we see you?
Hello, everyone.
Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you clear, loud and clear. Thank you, Peter. And then Vikki, are you with us?
Hello.
Okay, great. So I believe that we've got everyone on. What we're going to do is just do a quick around the table introductions. Starting with Mary, just in the order of introduce you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this conversation. Why you wanted to
Hi.
do that today.
Thanks, Carl. I'm really grateful to be with you tonight. Mary Blanchard. I live in Downers Grove, one of the western suburbs. And Carl and I met each other back in 2015, 16-ish. And it was after we had experience with our son when he was freshman and sophomore in high school, had an anxiety and depression event that was really severe. And learning to navigate that with all the different elements, whether it was school or with those providers we were working with, it was really an eye-opening journey for me. And, we had resources. I mean, we had insurance, and I had an understanding employer, and we had financial resources, and it was still a really difficult process. And I remember standing in my kitchen at one point thinking, what do people do that don't have all the resources that we have? How do their children make it? Because I don't know if my kid's going to make it. And if even one of these little things would be different, if I wasn't able to stay home from work with him, then what? So it was, I realized the stigma that's involved, that we were very vulnerable. I realized I couldn't really talk about this with people even that were pretty close to me. I knew that it was stigma keeping me quiet, but I was afraid. And so after that, started a group in our town. I co-hosted a group for a couple of years with an independent bookstore called Raising a Resilient Child. And Carl helped us stand that group up, and we brought in different speakers and tried to break stigma down, and talked about the child parent Olympics that we all seem to be involved in, and commoditization of childhood that we've done, and really tried to bring that conversation to our suburbs. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mary. Chelsea.
I'm muted. That's why. Should have already learned this by now. Hi, everybody. I'm Chelsea Laliberte Barnes, she, her. I'm here for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm privileged to have spent some time with Carl in high school, where what's so interesting is that, I think it's so crazy the path that life takes you on. I'm a mom, and I have a 3-year-old son. I lost my brother Alex to an overdose in 2008, and from there started a nonprofit organization with my family that is now one of the largest recovery community organizations in the state of Illinois. And so I have seen and learned and just been so exposed to obviously mental health and how violence, poverty, racism, marginalization of people has contributed to the crises that we are facing today. Through the journey of doing my advocacy work, I became a social worker. I am a licensed social worker, and I'm a certified clinical trauma professional. So when it comes to violence and mental health, that's an area that I spend many hours a week focusing on with people in my office, at my private practice. And then, of course, another fun tidbit is I am running for office right now. I'm running for state representative in my community. And so I'm also talking to 100 people a day at the doors who are traumatized, and just want to thank so much for, bringing this conversation to the fore. I think it's so important that we're discussing this, and just, I'm very concerned about what happens when we don't have enough resources for people who need them. Like, if you're on Medicaid right now, only 25% of folks on Medicaid can access a therapist. Like, that's a big problem if we want to end violence. We aren't set up to be doing that. So I've spent a lot of time, both as a social worker, doing one-on-one with children, teens, families, adults, and also in the policy world. I've helped write and pass like 23 laws. So it's a journey, and all of it has to work together. And I love that slide, Carl, at the beginning with the triangle. It all has to work to make it make sense. So I'm going to shut up now and hand it over to somebody else who's smarter than me. And thanks for having me.
Hey, we're gonna monitor that negative self-talk.
Okay.
Peter, Mr. Pete, how you doing?
Hi. Good. Hi, I'm Peter Renwick. I am here because I've had the honor of meeting Carl over the years, and I just stand behind what he stands for in raising the visibility of mental health in America, because I think somebody needs to do it, and he's doing a great job. Part about my background is I've had the opportunity to work 10 plus years in special education, which puts me in a school setting. And I've worked in an elementary school and middle school, and I have seen that mental health starts as young as kindergarten. It never goes away, and the way we address it in our institutions is very important to me. And I have seen that as you get older, it's very hard to spot the issues, also address the issues, and be okay saying that you have a problem or you have a mental health issue. Most of the time, it's kind of like a bullying point, which is very sad here in America. But that's why I'm on here, and I'm ready to put my input from a school perspective.
Thank you so much, Peter. Angelica.
Hello, everyone. I know Carl because he's known me my entire life. I am his niece, and so he's literally known me since my own infancy. And so I am really excited to be here. I am a doctoral student in early childhood, studying curriculum instruction in early childhood. My experience goes back as far as from when I was babysitting in my own teenage years, all the way up to knowing I wanted to be a teacher, teaching preschool, and then getting into the administration portion of early childhood and eventually going into early intervention. And so I've actually been working with mental health and the discussing social, emotional, and brain development of children actually in their infancy. So we talk about situations such as fetal alcohol syndrome, how that affects the brain in children in their development stage. When we talk about social, emotional development, how they socialize with their home environment, how they interact with their home environment actually sets them up to be able to process how they will experience social interactions and interactions that will eventually affect their mental health as they get older. And so we look at mental health almost in its most infancy, starting beginning stages of how children and how we as adults grow into that stage of developing who we are, developing our identities, developing our self-awareness, and how we can use that, and how all of that trauma or positive experiences all come together to eventually develop us into how we will experience life as adults. And so I'm just here to share my expertise and my experience in that. And I'm excited to be on this panel of experts. Chelsea, we are all experts here. And so I'm excited to just hear everybody else's perspective as well as show my perspective and offer my expertise as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Vikki. How you doing, Vikki?
Good evening. My name is Vikki Webster. I am the Executive Director for the Reginald and Paul Sewell Foundation. I'm also a board member for American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Illinois chapter. How I became involved with Carl was after my first brother's suicide. I reached out for resources, and Carl happened to be an excellent resource, and we've stayed connected since then. Provided seminars and workshops for me as needed throughout my advocacy work. My two brothers, Reginald and Paul, that the foundation is named after, unfortunately, Reginald died by suicide in 2016. His brother, he was 22. His brother, Paul, died by suicide 2 years later in 2018. He was 21 years old. So our family has been doing a lot of advocacy work. None of us are clinically trained. This is coming from a place of experience and a place of heart to make sure that in every community, especially our Black and Brown communities, that they understand that mental illness is treatable and that it's okay to seek treatment, to overlook the taboos or the stigmas, that if you need help, that you need to reach out. So we do that by various ways. Different avenues we try to reach the youth. Since both of our brothers were young, that's one of my goals and platform, to get more young people to feel okay with saying, I'm having an off experience or an off day, and feel okay with talking to someone and actually being open to seeking, help, as well as our men. Men sometimes are a little more less likely to reach out for assistance or help. So in our advocacy work, that's one of our main goals, is to get people to be okay with seeking treatment so that we can end some of these stats from growing.
Thank you so much for joining us. And all of you, it's my honor to facilitate this panel. And jumping right into things, we're going to sort of start something that might be a little bit in the pocket for you, Chelsea. I'm not picking on you, I swear. But one part of the elephant in this room, especially for some of our audience, is going to be the whole thing about gun reform. And this isn't to roll eyes at it. We can talk about very specific bullet points and things like that at another time. That's probably a bad choice of language. But one thing I do think is relevant here is what about the conversation in which, when it comes to resistance to even talking about reforms and solutions, how do we communicate with our peers? What's effective tools to, stats may not penetrate somebody's give a shit factor, excuse my language. Have you ever found, especially because of the endeavors you're going into right now, what are some things you found or you think might be useful in terms of communicating to our peers the correlation between trying to do something about guns and trying to reduce violence?
That's a tough question, but it's a really good question. So the good news is that I think a lot of our peers, and I guess I could just speak for the millennials, believe in reform, believe in that there has got to be a different way around this, not just to fix a problem that exists right now, but to address the root causes. We spend a lot of time talking about Band-Aid solutions, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about root causes and educating ourselves and the people in our lives on why this is happening. Why is violence happening? Why, what happened with COVID? Like, we're all experiencing secondary trauma every day when we watch violence. We're all experiencing even direct trauma every day when we're exposed to abuse and gun violence and other issues. And so it's really important, I think, for us to be providing resources to our friends and family on where to learn more, because this is the generation that I think has started at least that conversation. I think Gen Z is definitely a lot more amped and raring to go, but we have to meet people where they're at. And so if somebody in your life is like, I don't know if guns are the issue, well, listen to them and understand where they're coming from. You have to start by listening. You can't always, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And so I think listening is key, and just sharing. I think it was Vikki who said, your experience. Like, this is my experience. This is how I was impacted watching this event, learning about Uvalde, learning about what happened in Tulsa, learning about George Floyd's murder, learning about that. This is what it was like for me. People relate more to emotions than logic. So I think we've got to start there, really at that human piece.
That's phenomenal. That's such a good point. Meeting people where they're at is really a powerful idea. And I noticed, in the coverage from Texas, I couldn't help but notice that news anchors, local or national cable, what have you, a lot of them would get teary-eyed and emotional, even more so than in recent, maybe other instances. And a lot of them, when you went back, it was the anchors or the casters who were parents, and they couldn't get the words out. And so that's really interesting that you brought that up, Chelsea. And you said something else there that I want to expand to everyone, is this thing about trauma. We all experience psychological injuries, and the fact is how do we right now proactively talk with those around us, particularly youth, to engage the fact that they're traumatized? We're all traumatized, and it doesn't just have to be youth, but what are some things you can think of, all of you, in talking about right now, your friends, family, a child in a classroom, or your loved one could be traumatized by just being bombarded with this information. And it's real trauma. How do we help not let these wounds exasperate and escalate? I want to sort of have some thoughts on that. For instance, in a classroom, Peter, I'm going to pick on you a little bit here. Have you had students, ask about it, or have you at least had discussions among your co-teachers, your peers? How do we talk about this? Because I know a lot of the networks we've worked, back channel with helping schools frame conversations.
So after Uvalde happened, we did have a discussion with our classes, and you could just me visualizing the room, I could see that, some kids were numb to it, or some kids weren't even paying attention, but there were some kids that were super interested in hearing about the information and all that. And I think that's one of the issues that we have to tackle, is the people that not paying, or the kids, students, and even staff, like not paying attention, that feel numb to it. We need to bring to the forefront of what kind of the root causes are, because like you said, Carl, we all have trauma, whatever it is. We have trauma that, you know, we have addressed or we haven't addressed. And I think that's, we need to break down that barrier of being able to talk about maybe our weaknesses or making ourselves vulnerable, so that we can fully be self-aware of who we are and where we stand in this big space called Earth and world, and where we stand in our life. But we also need to, as humans, accept our roles in society and see that we leave this world better than we entered it.
I dig that. Angelica, from your very specific background, is there anything that sort of comes to mind in terms of, both for the kids and, you know, if you're a parent, for instance, what is some things to be aware of? How could you be supportive to combating the trauma harm?
So one of the things that we have to realize is that we are in a time where saving space for safetyness is important right now. So while my children, or the particular age group that I work with, they may not understand that there may have just been a mass shooting. What they do understand is when they come to school the next day, when they come to summer camp the next day, they will have to do a drill of some sort. This particular drill is what we call an active shooter drill. In the active shooter drill, what centers or schools will do is they will have a code, something, or that is known through training, um, that will alert the educators, the teachers in the room, that there's an active shooter in the building. Then it's our job to gather all of the children and take them to the nearest safe space. In my time in the classroom, it was, we had bathrooms in our actual classroom, so that was the bathroom. That was the closest safe space. And we were told that we keep the children as quiet as possible, you know, sing small songs, things that we can do. So at that point, children do become aware that something is going on. Why? Because why do we all have to come into the bathroom with each other and be as quiet as possible? They know school is the place where they can come and be themselves. They can come and, you know, get a hug from their teacher. They can come and play with their friends. They can come and, you know, have a lesson or commune together. And now something has changed and has become different. And so, in this point, what we as educators, we as facilitators, we as parents, what do? We allow them safe space to answer questions, to ask questions, rather, and answer their questions as honestly but as purely as possible, because we don't want them to become afraid to come to school, and we also don't want them to be afraid to go into the safe spaces that they have to go to in the event that something does happen. And so being honest, but also saying, I am here to protect you. I'm here to keep you safe. I, as your educator, as your teacher, have all of the tools and resources and knowledge to make sure that you are okay. Um, and while we think about the children in the situation, also think about the teachers, because that teacher is me. And every time I think about that, I know that for me, if it was me, it would have been the same thing. I would have protected my students to the very end if I could. And so being honest, reserving space to let them ask questions, and being cognizant that they are aware, they do understand that things are happening and going around in the world. They know that the mood has changed, the shift has changed, They're very internal beings. And so they know when I come in and I say, we have to be really quiet, they immediately become curious as to why. And so explaining to them, we are doing this in the event that we have to stay safe. So we don't have to say, it might be a shooter coming in the building, but we do have to say, this is a safety thing. We have to remain safe, and this is how we're going to remain safe, because there's somebody who's here who's not supposed to be here. And so we are going to keep ourselves safe by doing these steps, right? And so that's how we approach it, as the adults, giving ourselves time to process so that we can be the best that we can be for our students. We give, and very rarely do we ever take a moment to stop, reflect, and pour back into ourselves. So take the moment. If you're anything like me, cry in the corner, because that's what I did. Cry in the corner, reflect, and then, go into action for your students.
Thank you. That's a perfect elaboration on very, very, very powerful tools that can be used. And I want to expand that. We're talking a little bit about outbound to the community, but the fact is all of you here have been digesting the news too. And I kind of want to just do a little checkup here about how have you been processing the violence and sort of reflections of, are you finding yourself able to stay level and healthy? Normal is just a setting on a washing machine. But like, have you found yourself, what's been helping you stay functional? Have you found yourself not being functional? We'll talk about community at large in a second, but I kind of want to just talk about your personal impacts at the moment. Because, let me start right there. Anyone want to riff on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, when you called me to be on the panel, you know what I said. I had some swear words, and I was in an Epsom salt bath, to be honest, Carl, when you called. I mean, it just, whatever time in the middle of the day it was, I was pretty angry for a few days. And I do what I can to try and be, as even keel as I can be. I learned to meditate after, after we experienced what we did with our son. Was one of the tools that I used to heal my mental health. And so that's a tool that I depend on. But, I had a lot of anger for several days, and it comes in spikes. And I do tend to avoid the news a bit because I get really immersed in the feelings and emotions of that. And I cry a lot. I cry easily. And, the cognitive dissonance is so deafening. I'm supposed to go about my workday. I'm supposed to get on Zoom calls and pretend like everything's just fine. And that split that we have to make all the time it's like whiplash.
Yeah, that's such a good way of explaining it. And anger, Vikki, I saw you sort of nodding your head along with that. How have you been able to sort of, what was your sort of reactions and, Buffalo and then Uvalde, and it's just sort of, we got Tulsa yesterday, and how's your thoughts been on there?
I think for me, can you hear me? I think for me, one of the things that bothers me the most is we have so many vulnerable communities in Chicago. With
connection, we're going to come back to Vikki. Pete, did you want to pick up, because I saw you look like you were about to jump into, and I hope I didn't cut you off.
No, you're good. So at first, when I heard the news, I had utter disgust, and then my parent hat came on, and just fearing for my 4-year-old daughter who may go to school soon and have to go through like that training. And I just, as a parent, you don't want your child ever to be scared, but they need to know and be aware of what's going on. And then I go to school and put on my teacher hat, and every teacher has done this. You walk into a classroom or walk through a building, you look for your safe spots, you look for spots to get out, you look for spots, you could run and hide, and myself as a person, my first thought would be the safety of the students. That's, just the person I am. I'd rather see them, go on and continue life. As if I can save many, I would do that. Obviously, it's really hard that I'm a parent too. But in that moment, you just think of what's best. What can you do with your abilities to be the best person you can be for your students and for your coworkers in your community. Just, it was just, I keep juggling back and forth of anger, disgust, pre-planning for things. And, it's just, I have to be there for my students. So I keep going, and I have to be there for my daughter and wife. And so I keep going for them.
Thank you for sharing. It's very powerful. And Vikki, we little communication disruption, but are you good to go?
Yeah. Me for a second. I'm ready. So mine is anger also. We have a safety zone at work at UIC where I work. In our department, we went through active shooter training as one of our modules. And for us, surprisingly, it's the kitchen within our suite. But the weird part is it has a huge piece of glass. So even if it was a safety zone, the person could actually physically, they could actually. And it makes me think about people or children who live in vulnerable communities and households where guns and gangs are prevalent. How do we create a safety zone for them when it's there, when it's prevalent, when it's right there? So where do they escape to? In schools, it's a tragic when it happens anywhere, but how do we protect the vulnerable areas that are less likely to have any type of resources or anyone to guide them to safety? And I think that's what I keep toying with back and forth. When I think about the tragedies of the massacres, how horrible they are, and to try the teacher to be in that moment, gather your students up, and if you took that and you put it in a scenario where it's just children in your own household, then that's what it becomes even more heartbreaking to me. So, what do we do to get safety nets within communities? Are there shelters? Are there places to go to, to feel safe? If they hear bullets or if they see someone with a gun, can they run? Do they know to run? So those are my concerns.
And that's a whole different picture of early education than maybe a lot of places, people can not understand and appreciate it. And I think we're going to be tucking into resources to talk about violence is not just the lone mass shooter, which is certainly flavoring this, but when people talk about mass shootings, a lot of those numbers and statistics are part of a sort of pivot that people who are resistant to gun reform like to blame. You'll hear someone who say, "Oh, well, what about Chicago?" Because a lot of us are oriented around Chicago. And I want to go into that, but there was something that you mentioned that really makes me think about, Chelsea, from the clinical hat, communication. So a big thing about getting people to feel comfortable talking, and the anger part, right? I kind of want to talk about that a little bit, about creating conditions to people want to hide their anger sometimes and conceal it, and think that's the healthiest way, or it's unhealthy to even say they're angry about something. And I just wonder if this sort of is a starting point for you to just how to encourage your coach to keep that pathway open to talk about your anger and frustration.
Well, going back to safe spaces, I mean, so many people grew up in homes where they weren't allowed to talk about their anger. And I think that, or they only saw what anger looked like. They weren't able to put words to it, which is trauma in and of itself. The lack of being able to narrate what's actually happening and connect the brain from your central nervous system, literally. And most people don't even know that that's what that is. So there are people who we have been graced to have in our world, like Brené Brown, who literally just wrote a book called Atlas of the Heart. This is not a promotion for her, by the way. I'm just saying the whole intention of the book was to teach people what their feelings are. Because I was raised by people who were raised by the silent generation. So the assumption was there's no problems unless I could visibly see that there's a problem. So going like in a different scenario, when my brother was using, well, he had good grades. He had lots of friends. He was really handsome. Presumably there's no problem. So what do I have to look for, right? And I think it's our natural inclination to disconnect first, to disassociate first, to avoid first, that actually keeps us from connecting and getting to that core of, I'm not well right now. Some people don't even know that they're not feeling well because they're not in tune with their body. So Renee wrote this book, and the whole book is literally, this is what stress can feel like in all of the realms of stress. There are many, but when you are coming up in the world, you only know happy, sad, and pissed off. Like that's the language we have. We don't have language to describe all of these other things that are going on. So that's why I think it's so important that schools are putting such a huge focus on social emotional learning, trying to weave that into lessons every single day, bringing in more special education folks like Peter, and my sister's a special education teacher. So I think that we have to teach our kids what we weren't taught, which is really, really hard to do because you don't have a roadmap. So I think to your point about just in general communication, like we shut down quick because it's so hard to feel the feelings. So if that's our response, and I'm standing, like I was talking to this guy today when I was door knocking, and he said, all of these people in Chicago who are shooting up, just shooting into groups of people. And he was like angrily yelling at me while he was saying this. You could see how angry he was that this is happening. They all need to be locked up forever. And even though like in my like higher brain, I know like there's no arguing with this right now. There's no point, But he was so angry, and it was coming out as a projection towards an idea. And and it meant something for him, for somebody to be able to sit there and just hear him. So I think we just have to show it. We have to just kind of do it, even though it feels really uncomfortable. We just have to take our own risks in a sense and say, I feel really uncomfortable right now. I don't know exactly why, but I'm just uncomfortable right now. Like I feel weird in my chest. My chest is tightening. I don't know what it means, but I'm not feeling well. And so my trauma response is fight. I think that's why people end up becoming legislators. They just want to do something about it. So the minute that this happened, I wanted to know, what are all the different laws we should be passing? Which legislators I should call? I wanted to have like my checklist of things all done. I wanted to just be around other people who wanted to be in community as well, that were really frustrated about this. But if you are isolated because that's what you've been taught to do, how are you going to know community is there? It's possible, it's available, and maybe it's safe. So I know that that's like a lot, but I think too, like to what Vikki, and I'm sorry, is your name Angelica? Angelica are saying, could you imagine being exposed to that every single day on the south side of Chicago? And like, it's a part of your world. It's a part of your life every single day. Like if you're driving in a car and you're not white, the rules that come with that the things you have to learn so that when you get pulled over by a police officer, you aren't harmed by the police officer who's supposed to be creating safety, like every single day. So anyways, I know that was kind of tangential, but the clinical piece of me, we have so much to do around our own personal journey with our emotions. That's what all of that was meant to say.
And Chelsea, I just want to take a second and just piggyback off of that and just say, it's hard, especially teaching this to children, and minority children especially, because we do project-based learning, and one of the projects that always comes up is community or like jobs, and what do I want to be when I grow up, right? And there's always that one child who's like, I want to be a police officer. And I immediately trauma, right? I immediately go into like, how do I teach this? Like, do I separate all of my kids and say the police are safe for this group, and all of my group here in this project, we're going to talk about all the ways that the police can be safe for you. If you do all of these things, you all just have to exist. But here are the rules for you. And I try to, and it makes me want to avoid it altogether. But I know as their educator, I have to still say, the officers are safe. They are nice. If you are lost, go to them. This is what we're doing. But my other reality is I know that for my little brown children, as they get older, that narrative, they have a 50-50 chance. It could be that the officer was safe for you and he got you what you were supposed to do, and you were supposed to, you came out okay, or it was the opposite. And now
That's so hard.
Yeah.
Because you feel like you want to be honest with your students, and then their parents are going to have to tell them something different. You feel like you're telling them a message that isn't truthful for them and could be dangerous. And I don't know how you navigate
and then
that
the parents
one.
also come to me and say, you're teaching my children about cops, and we teach them that you see one, you run away, and you're teaching them, you see one, go toward them, if they will make you be safe. So what's the balance there? How do you, and we're talking about 3, 4, 5-year-olds. We haven't even talked about kindergarten, first grade, second grade. It's starting at the babies. Our babies are starting to be affected. They're starting to notice. We have babies who come and say, my uncle by a police officer, my brother, they know.
Yeah.
And so we have to teach, and again, create the safe space, because we also want to say, you can, because you can, and become different. You can become the police officer who's the change that we can see, who we want to see actually keep people safe and say they're going to do what policers are always going to do, if you make it to that age to become one for this group versus this group. It does become hard. So we keep safe space. And I still do it. I have my way of, how do we breathe? How do we maintain? How do we do? But it's always that like that knife in my heart that is like, oh, I hope I don't turn on my news one day in a couple years and be like, well, that lesson didn't go the way I thought it would.
And we're like, how would I explain this to little me? How would I have wanted somebody to explain this to me in my little kid brain that can't process the information that we now, it's so hard what you're talking about. I can't even imagine. My goodness. It's a privilege alone
so many
to not have to have those conversations with like that I don't get to have. So, wow, just exactly.
It's so many layers we have to have. I mean, is that conversation? My question is, have we gotten to a place where that is a conversation we're having with 3 or 4-year-olds, or even 5-year-olds? I don't know. I think I'm way older than you guys, and I grew up in various eras rather. I was, born in the 60s, raised in the 70s. My young adult life was the 80s, which was awesome. So now it's the 90s. Things are weird. 2000 things are weird. But I guess I come from a generation where cops were respected, and it was great to be a cop, a nurse, a flight attendant, a doctor, a teacher. So I think what for me was gut wrenching hearing is that we have to teach our black and brown kids that you have a 50-50 chance of surviving if you're pulled over by a cop or if you have an incident with a cop. And that's an issue. That's a real problem. My two brothers, I don't know if they were still alive, I would probably feel fearful for them, more so getting killed by gun violence than them getting pulled over. I mean, that's just me. I never really felt that threatened. That's why I said, and it starts in the home where people are suffering from trauma inside of their own home. There's no safety. There's no one to talk to, no one to say, hey, this is going on in my house. This is happening. Can I talk to you discreetly? Can you get some help for me? We're not giving them the green light on that. And that's what we need to do instead of focusing on bad. I've never personally had a bad experience with a white cop, ever. I'm 57, and it doesn't mean that I won't. It just, ironically, I have not, and I've lived in Chicago my entire life, and I've worked in Chicago my entire life. So I wish we could just get past having the white cop as a bad cop. There are bad black cops as well. So let's just be honest and candid with that and talk about ways to express themselves so that they can talk about any situation that's uncomfortable in their household or in school or anywhere. Those are things to me that are important that I advocate for, and just hearing that we have to get to a point where we have to tell kids be careful around a police officer is absolutely hurtful. It is.
I'm glad you brought it up as hurtful. I think there's an uncomfortable reality here that there's a privilege, and taking this all the way up to the idea about gun control, there's a privilege to talk about things like violence exclusively as gun control and access to firearms and things, because talking about violence in America is an intersection that is really hard for a lot of people to appreciate. Guns in America predating, I swear to gosh, I'm not going to go on a history tangent. I mean, I am, but just bear with me. But, predating the actual existence of America, gun ownership beyond frontiers people, okay, gun ownership in urban and community spaces is not linked to defense or colonial or British or even the French coming into British colonists' homes. It's linked to slave revolts, okay? And I'm talking about before there's the Declaration of Independence. I'm talking about mid-1700s. Slave revolts was a primitive primary fear. Now, there's going to be a lot of eye rolling if you try to do the whole history of explaining this and Klan come from that and da-da-da-da. But the idea of preventing, you hear the slippery slope talk about resistance to gun reform because it's one piece of legislation means we're going to ban all guns eventually, okay? In Canada, probably didn't help that conversation in America, but the other conversation that's being had is the way that we are harmed by violence. So people say, well, what about Chicago? And the violence in Chicago, all right, let's talk about that. One, that's easy access to weapons that aren't just coming from Illinois. They're coming from gun shows in every other country, and they're being sold by people who, Remington is not punching out bullets and rifles in Chatham and Bronzeville, okay? That's coming in, and the people who are carrying chunks of it and selling it, I mean, I'm pretty sure if I go to a gun show in Michigan City, Indiana, where there's a regular one, and I go and buy a trunkload full of guns, if I do it 10 times in a year, if Illinois state troopers aren't following me on some sort of case, I'd be disappointed. And that's being sort of arbitrary, but the point being is that, like, the way violence works in America and the people who are the most subject to it are the most marginalized people. And that's not a bug in the system. That's a feature of systemic racism. One of the most galling things about school mass shootings is that it's actually a defect from systems that have been built to privatize and secure the safety and the body autonomy of white, middle class and above Caucasian or ethnic Europeans in America. And that's not being controversial. That's the point of redlining. That's the point of putting cops, you know, you want to talk about in Chicago, that's the point of putting mass patrols on Austin Avenue between Oak Park, okay, and anything around Oak Park, and putting mass patrols in Hyde Park and anything around Hyde Park, and any other sort of neighborhood like that. You know, it's these restrictive things. It's the convenience of a suburb is that it's supposed to clean these things up. So when you have a Columbine, there's a certain thing. I mean, there's even a brutal intersection with the fact that Uvalde is and I'm just gonna say this is really uncomfortable and people don't want to talk about it, but Uvalde is a Latino-dominated school, and they waited an hour. The cops at Columbine got roasted for waiting 30 minutes. Roasted really bad, and they still went in after Klebold and Harris, okay? And I'm just saying, like, if those cops, and there had to be intersectional cops, there had to be Latinos and Black folks on those law enforcement teams, but it forces you to ask, like, you know, was it easy for those cops to disengage and wait an hour? Was it the AR-15 scared the shit out of them? That's fine. We're all humans. That's an acceptable reality. But because of the long history of dehumanizing people of color, there's a scary, scary thing that you don't want to lay as a claim as a fact, but it just makes you wonder, if Uvalde was fucking Nutrier, okay, are they waiting an hour? Is not one of those cops want to play John McClane? Like, not a single one of them wanted to be like, to hell with the commander, I'm going in. Listening to all those gunshots. So closing up, because I know, Chelsea, your time might be a little limited here. I do want to come back to the fact that gun violence and mental health isn't just, mass violence in America isn't just about gun legislation. It's about resources and conversations that we need to be having in our community spaces, because a lot of the violence that we see seems to be from people who are silent, who aren't talking. And so the way that we minimize mental health conversations seems to be a gigantic part of this. Not because every shooter had a mental illness, but a lot of the stories of these lone shooters, for instance, are people who seem to be isolated, whether they claim to be bullying, whether they're identifying as being bigots and racist or not. They seem to be people who there's not a willingness to have conversations. And it seems like, Chelsea, what you said about listening, the person in Uvalde said a lot of things and posted a lot of things, and it seemed like nobody was listening. And I'm not trying to villainize the community. It seems like there's a lot. Yeah.
There were so many things that went wrong in Uvalde, and when the investigation has been complete, they will all be laid out for us to see, hopefully. But to your point, there are so many layers of the intervention that should have existed that didn't. We live in a society, right, that's so easy. It's easier to brush it away because then we don't have to deal with it, or, oh, this person's fine. They're just angry, or they're just ranting on social media. They're not going to do anything. You know, I think we just have a propensity to be like, you know, I just think I'm going to stay out of it. I just think I'm going to, you know, keep it, you know, that's why they keep saying, see something, say something. And, you know, in certain communities, you know, people don't want to be the narc, but I think, you know, the intention behind that term is literally to do something about it, even if it means saying, hey, dude, listen, I just read your post. Can we talk? Are you okay?
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a person you can talk to. Just even that one interaction alone could have changed the course of that person's decision making. You have no idea when you are impacting someone's life. You have no idea. And I think I've learned that too, doing advocacy work here, I think in the suburbs with police, which is crazy. Like, and here's the thing, like, when I started doing advocacy work, the only people who wanted to take my ideas seriously, and they were at the time like making sure that cops carried Narcan, because they were the ones coming to the scene of an overdose first. So they were the ones that could intervene. The people who were the most on board with that were the police, which was mind-blowing to me. at the time, because I thought there's no way they're going to want to do anything about this. So it's just so interesting how every community across our country has different cultural mores and the ways that they respond and react to the different things that are going on around them. We have to create a norm around reaching out and saying, I'm here, reaching out and saying, creating opportunities to connect with people. COVID did not help. Violence does not help. Watching it every day on the news does not help. So there are so many contributing factors to this, and I don't know what the answer is, Carl. I think it's just individual, like how I'm going to raise my child, like Peter was kind of saying. To when I was having a bad day last week and I was crying in literally in my bed, he was like, it's okay to be sad. And I looked at him and I was like, oh, okay, there's hope. He knew that it was okay to be sad. It's okay to be afraid. And I think it starts with us. I think that's really what I'm trying to say. And I do have to go, and I'm really sorry because I do have to go do the mom thing and negotiated with my husband on this time frame. But I'm taking so much away from this. You are all wonderful, and thank you for sharing just your thoughts and your truth and letting me be a part of this conversation. So sayonara.
Get elected.
Woman.
Get elected, woman.
I'm
We need
trying.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you
Carl.
for joining us,
Let's
Chelsea.
just free out.
Goodbye,
Thank
audience,
you.
who I can't see.
And to keep it going, I actually, speaking of audience, thank you, Chelsea. Someone in the chat, Studio Goobly, if I read that correctly, wrote two things that I want to sort of kick off here. There were two comments I saw. Studio Goobly wrote, emotional intelligence, teaching kids emotional intelligence and how to read their own emotions is so important. Not only does it help themselves, but it also helps them to be more aware of people around them. Let's keep that in our head for a second. And then another thing that Studio Ghibli wrote that I want to Goobly wrote was, every time a mass shooting happens, our government talks about mental health. Then they continue to underfund mental health care and resources. So let's continue this part of the conversation about it's an action item. Because Vikki, you're talking about the dismay of the way there is an attitude. There really does. It's a very salient attitude to have to be warning and educate certain parts of our community about police. Okay, that there's a lot of people who get really uncomfortable because it's a zero-sum game. It's either ACAB, which is the acronym All Cops Are Bastards, or people want to take a nuanced approach, but some. And I think we can come back to those discussions, but a thing that's really, 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 really important is this idea of communication education and social emotional education. What we can be equipping ourselves in our community spaces with, getting people to express themselves. So I kind of want to just talk amongst you. Mary, because I feel like you'd be comfortable here, you cannot support your son until you recognize there's a problem. Can you identify the pathway that even made that possible? Because that's sort of an example of what we're talking about broadly.
Yeah, I mean, for him, there were a few things that collided. And one of them was that he had a concussion history and he had to stop playing hockey, and he loved hockey, and it was really his identity, which if we look back on it, this is another thing we do, right? Kids are in sports, and because of the way we do this now, would I do it differently? I don't think so, because he had an absolute passion for it, and it gave him so much joy. But what it does, though, because of the way the sport's constructed, that became his social life, his everything, his identity. And you end up doing that way because of the structure. So then the other things that you could do that are social or otherwise or more organic, they fall away. And your whole world kind of becomes this one thing. And so that one thing went away, and his identity then kind of went away with it. And I was just sitting there not knowing what to do. I'm an action person trying to throw things at the situation. But then it also, there was a physical thing that happened that contributed to it. He had an illness and it went undiagnosed. That was where we were in spin in the medical community for several weeks, and they couldn't diagnose him. And he was in pain, and he was losing weight, and all these things were going on. And finally, when they did figure it out, that he had to have a minor surgery, and they gave him Norco. And I think combined with the concussion event, just even being on Norco in a pattern with, Tylenol for a week, he came off the Norco and he had a Norco event where it clearly had messed with his brain. And from there, he had already missed like 6 to 8 weeks of school. And now he's having this kind of mental health event, and he was already struggling. So that just settled into sort of a spiral situation. It was all very much in our face, and just dealing with all of the components of that, the physical part, then trying to get him on track on the mental part, trying to deal with the school to get them to understand the state that he was in, to help them help him, very difficult. So I think, if I look back on just his entire life, right, I think centering our mental health as the core of our health in total is something I would have focused on more as a parent. So I try to do that now and as we go forward, but we have to start doing that for ourselves, and that's not how we treat our health. You go in to see the doctor, they're treating a physical symptom, but our mental health affects everything with the rest of our physical health too. And I know you can't take care of it all in a 10-minute visit because, the system is stacked to have, insurance companies want to pay for a 10-minute visit when you're at the doctor, but we need to have that engagement in that way in the healthcare community where we're getting some checks on let's find out how people's mental health is in that way. I think a lot about the loneliness that exists. I think about, social media and platforms and things like that are taking the place of maybe relationships. And I think about the fact that oftentimes the police are dealing with mental health issues and there's not a social worker on staff. They're not equipped. Things escalate. There's so many pieces and parts of that. So it's not the question you asked me exactly. I'm starting to spin off into a bunch of things, Carl, but it just all feels so interconnected to me around the fact that we are, I blame Reagan. I think you're the one that taught me this, Carl. I mean, he's the one that, pulled the whole behavioral health, the mental health thing. He really started to deconstruct it, right? And I look back on a hospital in, it was a 2-hospital town in Kansas that I was working with back in the mid 2000s. And one of the hospitals was a faith-based hospital, mission driven. And they made the decision that they were no longer going to accept mental health patients in their emergency department, turned them away. So the community hospital said, we're here for the community, we're going to take them in. But this is a choice that they made. It's just, and it goes back to the one. It's kind of like, are you going to be the hospital that's going to turn away? Or are you going to be the hospital that's going to help the community? Are you going to be the person that's going to hear someone's cry for help and reach out to them? Or are you going to be the one that says, oh, haha, that's funny? This young man was living with his grandmother. Clearly there's childhood trauma there. It all stacks up. And when I think about, bullying, I was under the mistaken impression, I'll blame Reagan again, that, there was an anti-bullying policy in schools. There's not. It's a punishment system that was designed, not to prevent bullying. It was punitive to prevent drugs and crime in schools, again, to protect white people. So anyway, I'm all over the place, Carl.
No, but this is the way this conversation goes because, and that's quite frankly why it's a lot easier for folks to think about things like background checks and delays and talking about guns in that microcosm And look, people who are for gun reform, for instance, actually find themselves a lot of them find themselves stopping dead when somebody does do, well, what about Chicago? Or things like that, which is especially being in the Chicagoland area, it's a frustrating thing to say. But I want to go back to the fact that, because it's inescapable, is mass violence in our community. Yeah. Okay.
It's infuriating because people always say mass shootings in Chicago, mass shootings in Chicago. And I'm like, I don't live in Chicago. I actually live in the more southern part of Illinois. And there's mass shootings here. we look at the fact that Chicago is the big city of Illinois, but there's mass shootings downstate, there's mass shootings upstate, there's mass shootings in different states, and we have these conversations of, and I even want to play a little bit of devil's advocate, because I see this post go around in the African American community that I'm like, I hear you, but that's really not the point, where they're like, we may have our gun violence and we might have our gangs, but we've never shot up a school. And I'm like, is that the message we want? Is that the message we're throwing out there? Right? So, like, that doesn't put us on some higher pedestal, because even though we may have the mass shootings, it wasn't at the school. So that made it okay. But it might have been at the park, where children are also wanting to go play and be safe. Or it may have been in front of the community center, where the children want to go be safe. Or it may have been outside of their front door, where the children should want to go and be safe. So it may not have been in the school, but that doesn't give you
the moral high ground.
Yeah, to now stand on your pedestal and be like, it wasn't a school. Like, no. We have to take accountability and a responsibility to say, I am willing to abide by whatever reform might come. Even people who are for guns, if you're for guns, peace and blessings be upon your house. But would it really be so hard to say, I am okay with going through a harder process to get and keep my guns, so that people who may not pass that same whatever might come of it, maybe you got to be older, or now you have to, show you have mental health, or do a couple counseling sessions and have that card, like whatever the reform might come, if it ever comes, are people who want to have their protection, because I do understand that. Are they willing to say, I am okay with taking these necessary steps, so that those who cannot take those steps are kept from things that can harm others, these weapons that will harm others? And the other thing that became infuriating is that border control became a conversation, because they were like, he was a Mexican, and was he a citizen? That, like, when that question happened, that's when the anger came in for me, right? Because at first I was like, this hurts. It's children, it's students. And then they were like, well, did he jump over the gate or jump over the wall? And I was like, we are totally missing the point. Now we're just pointing fingers. Now we're just doing this. Now it's you did this and you did that and you did this and we over here. We're missing the point. The point is, what are we going to do now that this has happened 3 weeks in a row now? Can we agree that this is an issue? Can we agree that something needs to happen? Can we agree that whatever happens can make it so that, I don't know, I don't know the answer, because I'm not in legislation. I'm not in law. I stay away from those things as much as possible. I'm in it enough to be educated, but not enough to inundate myself with so much information that it becomes information overload. for me. I will just kind of set my algorithms to where I can only see so much of it on my Facebook or my social media. But something has to be done. I don't think anybody has the perfect answer, but doing nothing is also is the first thing that is not the answer. Doing nothing is absolutely not the answer. So now that we know doing nothing is not the answer, what are we going to do now?
And that's such a great point in it. The fact that you brought up the border part, and even that the in this case, in all these cases, the shooter was brought down by a border patrol agent who did go in, who happens to be Latino descent, is a whole other bag of worms. But it's also back to this frustrating multi-intersectional thing about how violence in America is perpetrated and works, and it's prioritized. Somebody going back to one of the things I highlight from Studio Goobly, who is I self-identify as the good homie, is self-identified as the good homie Gabby. What's up, Gabby? The shootings happen and mental health gets blamed, but mental health continues to be underfunded. And I can't help but notice when we're talking about these intersectionalities, you notice how quick you can see legislation roll out to try to control and regulate the human body when it's someone they can detach from. So, those possessing a uterus, right? Okay, you can see how quick legislation can come up to try to regulate and ban the teachings of things about the reality of race in America, or anything that talks about somebody's identity and orientation beyond the false sort of heterosexist mentality. Boom, 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 things roll out. Then these mass violence happens, and you get, well, let's take a second, but you also get this thing, and I broke a record here. I go back to the whole, it doesn't matter whether you're in California or New York, the what about Chicago thing is also an intersectional, it's a totem, okay? Saying what about Chicago is a code word, okay? It's the PC way of saying, what about those blacks? Okay. But Chicago, because it's north, it's liberal, it's democratically, historically held, and mental health services, you talk about Reagan, mental health services were may have been federally cut by Reagan, but, we had two Democratic mayors in Chicago slash and burn our public mental health services to the ground. And that's not both sides thing. It's just the reality of prioritization. People who are marginalized isn't just by a skin color, even though that's a very easy target and that's what happens. It's an economic part to that too. The skin color is just part of the identification code, a hierarchy system for how a lot of people are going to get screwed over or underserved. So, Pete, for instance, working in special ed, okay, in a public education system, can see the same level of underfunding and lack of prioritization for services that could change, positively impact, or nurture people's lives that other people of color, other low-income people who don't have access to healthcare see as adults on the street. All those are forms of violence too. And, that's what I go back to the whole thing about. It's almost a privilege to think of mass violence, to think of gun reform as just exclusively a background check, delay this, delay that, because the lack of funding for resources that, let's get really scary. Chelsea, before she left, talked about meeting people where they are. What if you have systems in place where someone who's so angry that they can minimize the dignity of another individual and think that their anger is justified to cause and bring harm onto others? What if somebody could take those emotions and go somewhere? And I didn't say coddle them. I didn't say feel, whatever. What if they just went somewhere with them, or that could be red flagged and there were systems in place that didn't just punitively or put the scarlet letter on them, but was able to capture and put that person into a hug. Some sort of like communicative, non-punitive hug, where some people will roll their eyes and be like, well, that just sounds like some hippy-dippy bullcrap. But look, talking with someone and not brutalizing them might have a better thing than just, what we're doing now. And I just kind of want to, as we're sort of winding down here, Pete, and I'm picking on you a little bit here, Pete, because of the fact that you've had so much time in the special ed zone, where I know directly, not just as a product of special ed from first grade through high school, but also in mental health education and work that I've done, special ed sometimes has the pivot or the position of just setting these kids aside, just putting them into a holding pen and tolerating them till you can throw a diploma at them or bounce them out to adulthood. And I just want to bring you in here about talking about if in a perfect world for you, what do you think are services inside of a public education system that could support mental health and
Yeah, so definitely the history of it is children of different races are more likely to be labeled with a special ed identity, whether it be autism or learning disability or intellectual disability. It's a proven fact. Like, bottom line, that's what happens in the United States. And coming with that is labels. Right? They get labeled that kid or that kid. And I think that in and of itself, labels is kind of the root of the problem. And like you said, Chicago has the label of, oh, Chicago, what about the shootings in Chicago? Once you get a label, it's really hard to shed it. It's really hard to break away. And actually, sometimes in the institutions, it kind of pushes you toward that label to maybe act out or, whatever your label is, like maybe be quiet or be a jock or be a jerk, So I think part of my process is when I'm working in schools and especially students with special ed is breaking those labels. The labels they're hurtful and they can lead to definitely mental issues and bullying in school. And so that, my agenda every day is I work at a school with 700 kids and, my goal is to say hi to 500 of them. I ask them how their day is, how they're feeling, what they're doing, what they're doing this weekend, just to keep it natural that you can talk to a teacher without feeling judged or labeled. I just want to open and create a safe place. And I see the labels in the school, like they're all cliques, like the cool gang, the TikTok girls, the nerds, but we have to break those labels starting in school because some of those students, even with special ed or not, they continue that label, and that is really setting themselves up for failure because, again, they're not self-aware of who they are. They're just following the label. And we have to kind of break that mold. And that is many years of systemic racism and just the institution needs kind of a reboot and not push these kids towards their labels that we give them.
Carl, you talked about identifying things too. I think, Dylan my son represented some early symptoms of anxiety, and I got some not great advice from a therapeutic person, but there's some pretty standard things that we should just really be watching for as parents and be educated about. And I wasn't right. And I think that, we do eye checks for kids in school and we do hearing checks, and I think it's because stigma, we don't do those mental health checks. And I know that the high school here did start trying to do some questioning of freshmen in health class and just to do a mental health check questionnaire with them, and identified a student that was in a pretty immediate risk of harming herself. And when they contacted the parent, the parent was not receptive, that the child needed pretty immediate help. And so that, that's stigma, right? But if you started earlier, if we're starting those things earlier, and there's a lot to do in schools, right? Schools are responsible for a whole lot. So you don't want to add more burden there, but it is the place where they spend so much time and where there is that access, especially for those kids that might not have that support at home.
Well, and I think going off that is younger kids are so good at telling you how they feel.
Okay.
I'm mad, I'm hungry, I'm sad, but we need to feed into that. We need to like push them to always tell us how they feel, so that it's not they don't feel like it's a hindrance when they're telling how they feel, because we want to know that as parents, as teachers, as adults, we want to know how you're feeling and where you're at.
That's excellent, and I think that this, Vikki, I don't know if your Wi-Fi can sustain us. That reminds me of things that you talked about, because young adults, nurturing that would help keep a communication they may already innately have in them. And I know a lot of your work is about trying to help reopen communication among adults, particularly, you identified those who identify as men. The whole boys don't cry thing is pretty brutal and toxic and harmful. But just opening up communication, because I think you get to be your late teens, early 20s, regardless of your gender identity, you kind of learn it's as a defense mechanism to sort of keep like the game face up. And you did talk about that. I just wanted to hear more from you about things you found useful in getting, for instance, in your case, the work you've done, getting younger folks, particularly younger men, to reopen up or open up those guarded parts.
I think engaging them in educational events that they can relate to, like when we did Melodic Minds or Music on My Mind or Art of Healing, where they can relate to local rap artists who may rap or talk about some of their hardships or things they're going through, or how they associate or use their music or their drawings as a way, a coping mechanism. And I found that kind of opened up the gate for a lot of the younger generation to feel comfortable talking. If this guy is performing and talking about his struggles, then I can certainly talk to someone else. So those are things that I've been working on, as well as trying to find ways to engage youth so that they know that it's safe and it's okay. Or even if you have a person, and I've become that person for a lot of young adults. And again, I'm not clinically trained, but at least I can provide, resources for them to go to, or I could be a sounding board and at least, connect their families with, resources for them. But those are things that I've done personally, throughout my foundation work, or just as a humanitarian as well. And, also for people who are just released back from, being incarcerated. A lot of them go in with mental illness, they come out, it's worse. So also, advocating for them to have the treatment when they're inside as well as outside, so that they don't continue a cycle. So there are a lot of targets, audiences that need, to have that dialogue and communication, or as we call them, safe people to talk to. Fortunately, my younger brother, Paul, was able to talk to myself and my sister about some of his struggles. Eventually, he still succumbed to taking his life, but still knowing that he knew that someone was available that he could talk to, and he did. We could talk for hours, or he'd say, well, I need another counseling session. Just felt good knowing that he felt safe enough to confide in myself or someone else to seek help. So hopefully we can get other young adults, especially the young adults, young kids also, but it seems like that generation of 20 to 30, for some reason they're struggling. So that's part of my platform, Carl, is to get them comfortable enough to say, okay, I want to go in to see someone.
And thank you for sharing that. I really want folks who are watching right now, and if you're engaging this content at a later date, Vikki, when you talked about using platforms such as hip hop and things like that, mental health ultimately is our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And the only way to communicate our mental health is through self-expression. And yes, that's dancing and singing, but that's crying, that's screaming, that's anger, and that's talking. And because of the way stigma works to silence us, sometimes using self-expression platforms becomes the safe avenue to connect for people. And I think coming back into focus here when we're talking about mass violence, in a really nasty way, aside from there's there's tools that are used for harm, okay? And that's the guns and things like that. But what drives somebody to sort of devalue or think of themselves or be so in such a state that they're willing to risk other or harm other people's lives? We'll never have an exact answer for that. That's pretty sloppy to think you're going to have a pinpoint for every single person. But creating environments where you can mitigate that attitude by having people feel better connected. Well, that sounds like some sort of like, we are the world, we are one statement, if you're not careful. But the idea of creating opportunities, Angelica, the way you talked about it with early education, Peter, you talked about it, Mary, and Vikki, as you talked about it, there's always an opportunity where we can be starting conversations and reinforcing conversations that don't have to have a deeper, higher meaning, other than letting people express themselves and know that it's safe to make that communication. That is a connection. And the one thing that's consistent with, as far as the research that I've ever done, especially unfortunately leveling up for this conversation on mass violence, the correlation between people who go out and do mass shootings and whether they are alive now or evidence prior to their acts, a disconnect. And it's not a disconnect with faith or a disconnect with technology. It's a disconnect with other people that's happening. And that doesn't guarantee an answer, but it seems like when we talk about proactive prevention, finding ways to create connective factors for individuals seems to be a big part of it. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff, the reason why it's easy to be underfunded in mental health and have all these racial impacts is probably because of a lack of understanding and respect and appreciation for different people in different cultures and ethnicities. You can't be brutal to someone that you care about, theoretically speaking. But as we're winding down here, I kind of want to just leave with a little bit of something, because we're not going to get through everything, right? But leave with a little bit of something about, for each of you personally. I asked this question before about where's your head and where's your heart. And what I want to ask about this idea of mass violence and everything is, do you find yourself believing or having a sense of hope that we can work and make changes? Or do you kind of feel like a little bit, a little hopeless right now? And this, this is just real talk, right? So just going around the room and just how do you view things as it stands right now? I'm gonna do a reverse order and start with Vikki.
What was the question?
Just how, in terms of like where we are, and this isn't about we're going to change the world tomorrow, but do you feel hopeful that we can sort of turn the corner on this, on these issues, mass violence, interpersonal harm, or do you kind of feel like we just sort of
I think we could turn the corner on it. I think we have enough resources to start, but then again, it starts with legislators, people at a higher level to back some of the programs and outreach that a lot of organizations are trying to do. But it's definitely people out there that want to put in the work, that's willing to put in the work. We just need the people to be able to push the needle, to be on board and to get it done. But I'm hopeful. I honestly do believe that it can be done. And it starts with reducing mental health disparities, right? Getting more access to mental and behavior health, more access to substance abuse help. So I think those would kind of, even though the correlation, it's there, but it isn't there. I think it starts there with also just making people comfortable within themselves and taking away pressure and bullying that may lead to having thoughts of harming other individuals.
Thank you. And maybe I'll refine the question a little bit. So you help be the test subject with that, Vikki. That what is and you can re-answer this question. Because legislation, all these other things are big things that we got to work as a community. What's one thing you believe in doing that you think can make a positive impact on the situation?
Being a voice. Yeah, being right?
Yeah.
I think that's where it starts. Just being vocal about it, making a noise about it, getting other people on board, coming together in numbers, coming with a realistic goals and things that you can do within your own home, within your own community, and just executing those and hoping that everyone else can get on board and we can all come together, throughout the nation to stop some of this senseless, violence and killings.
Thank you very much, Vikki. Angelica.
I absolutely have hope. And the reason why I have hope is because I work with the purest of hearts, the children, and legislation and teachers and stakeholders have all started to have a big push towards social emotional development in early years and in early stages. And so there is now curriculums out that are solely about teaching children how to process their feelings and how to say what they are feeling in the moment. And there's trainings on how we as adults can help them do that, because processing your feelings is something that has to be taught. Social emotional development is something that has to be taught. We expect children to calm themselves down. We just say, we tell children, what do you have to be upset about? What do you have to be throwing a tantrum about? What do you have to be angry about? And the answer is so much, a whole lot. And the more they are unable to process why they are feeling what they are feeling and why they are feeling what they are feeling, and um how they can get guidance on how to recalibrate those feelings, they are being disserviced. And so I do have hope, because now in the baby stages, they're starting to get it. They're starting to say, "Oh, we need to have these things in place to have children be able to express themselves. We as the adults put our pride, put and if our superiority down to be able to listen to them, be able to say, I hurt you and I apologize for that. Not, you just a child, you that can't get hurt, right? No, I did something to you that made you cry and I apologize about that. I am sorry. Laying ourselves down so that children can be able to know that it's okay to say sorry, know that sometimes people will tell you no. And how do we deal with that rejection is a lot of ways that bullying starts, because somebody felt rejected, so now they feel rejected, so they got to project that rejection onto somebody else. That's where bullying comes into play. So how do we deal with rejection? How do we deal with when somebody tells us no? Where do we go from there? Right? So now that we have this push, the hope becomes that as these children get these tools for social emotional development, as they become adults, they will already know how to process their mental health. They'll already be able to say, "Oh, I'm feeling anxious. When I feel anxious, this is what I should do. I can breathe. I know to take a moment. I know to disengage. Oh, I'm feeling a little sad. Why am I feeling sad? Oh, because maybe my friend didn't come to school today. Or my favorite teacher isn't here. And so now I'm sad about that." So instead of lashing out in class, they know how to go to someone and say, "I'm sad because, I'm hurt because, I'd feel this way because." And then we now have the tools to say, "I understand you feel like this, and here is how I'm going to help you process those feelings." And so that becomes the responsibility of the teachers. It becomes the responsibility of the parents. It becomes a responsibility of their community, people around them. We as adults, we have to lay ourselves down to say, let's give these children a chance to be able to their emotions correctly, so we don't have this in the future anymore. So I think over time, hopefully I get to see it in my lifetime. That I say that like I'm like about to leave Earth or something. I'm not. I'm still very young, but like in my lifetime, I want to be able to see where they were going to go do this, but they knew to go get help, or they already had the tools in place to help themselves. So yes, I have hope.
Thank you. It's great. It's beautiful. Pete, Mr. Peterson.
Yeah, I do have hope for the future of where we're going. I think it starts as small as us, like raising the children, raising our children, raising the students we want them to be, and telling them that it's okay to be sad, anxious, or whatever, or deal with whatever is going on. It is okay, because if we just stop that, it's going to stop their growth. And like back to the social emotional learning, one of them is self-awareness. And again, that is self-awareness and self-management. It's so hard, and I can admit it, of being aware and managing my own emotions, right? We have to figure ourselves out first. And I work in a middle school right now where I'm seeing that day to day. People don't know where they fit in. They don't know, what kind of person they want to be. But just harboring that exploration is key for them to grow. And it gets harder the older you get, because you just push it off and push it off and push it off. And then, the real world hits you. Our mantra in America is work till you're burnt out. And I think there's a big issue in that. But one thing I do to harbor, or promote, healthy discussion about mental health is just being accessible. I've had many discussions even in middle school about, depression, anxiety, gender identity, ethnicity. I'm very open and honest with my experiences, because I've had many experiences with racism before. And even this year, I've had like at least 8 in this school year. So it's just being open and honest and showing that you can be vulnerable, but you can also find the tools to work through the adversity that you're thrown at. And I think that as long as I'm accessible and I'm alive and I'm walking, then I'm always going to check in on students and identify maybe those students that are struggling more than others, and always, say good morning, say hello, how you doing? Because a friendly face, at least you see one friendly face a day, it could change your whole day around.
Well, that's the truth. Thank you so much, Peter. Mary.
I have hope. I mean, I really think that our every personal interaction that we have matters, and that echoes out and makes a difference. I also really see so much potential in the young generations. They know so much more. They understand things about what's happening systemically, and I think that they have different expectations. And I think that they can bring some change. I think, I think it's important to continue challenging local governments, because everybody needs to feel that they belong somewhere too. And that is something that we're working on in this community now. And it's not easy, because, we're living in a suburb where it's not something that is embraced necessarily the way you would think it would be in 2022. So I have hope. Always do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I want to thank all of our panel members as we wind down today. If you're watching right now, or you're engaging us in a later date, this content, I want you to think about something when we talk about violence in America, and we can start from the very specific line item. We're talking about gun violence. And it can be easy to shrug and just be like, whatever. Someone who might be resistant to the idea of gun reform, a popular thing to say is, why should I, as a law-abiding citizen, have things impact me, because of a few bad actors? And by that same logic, there's a whole lot of people who are impacted by these bad actors who had no interest whatsoever to have any association with guns. And a lot of these conversations about violence in America, beyond just the idea of the gun itself, when we talk about the social institutional policies that can be violent and dehumanizing to the human experience, that has this inextricable intersection with not just mental health, but with our ethnicity and our culture, it's not our imagination that the answers, and there's not just a singular answer, but these answers are in us. And it's very easy to think of things like the government, things like mass shootings and mass shooters as these others, these entities that are beyond our control. But it's not idealism or blind idealism when we talk about the idea of government as the people. I'm not suggesting that the government as is or was or has been is serving all the people. That's not my point here. But every system that exists potentially has the ability to serve us because it has the ability for us to utilize it and manipulate it to serve our benefits. Currently, we find it seems to do more harm to us. But even in attitudes when people talk about something like defund the police, which is really just shorthand for reprioritize community funds, our tax dollars, to be channeled into ways that might be more effective to reducing harm, violence, instabilities of shelter, access to food, healthcare, and a number of other things. It's just easy to say defund the police. All of this comes back to the idea of violence in America. And what I want you to really pay attention to is that there are individual things you can be doing. There are things that you can be doing right this second that don't require that you have a doctorate, a textbook, or major government funding. And what those are investments in you as a person and in your people around you, peers, friends, loved ones, by regarding the dignity of each individual. Communication is key to this. Being able to be an open channel to build connections is part of this. But you as a person with these connections also has the ability to steer and shift these institutional policies that are harming us, whether it's a lack of gun reform or a lack of mandate to fund mental health resources. It is not beyond our power to do this. And it's not just get out there and vote. You may have to completely dismantle the prevailing political factions that seem to control the ballot box today in order to get the results you want. But again, it's not your imagination that it would just take our work doing that. So what I kind of want to close out on here with is that I have hope too. And it's not a blind hope or a gee golly, we're going to turn the corner hope. It's a knowing fact that together, see, we're not in this together. That's not true. We're coming from different intersections that society has sort of scattered us to. But we can do things together. And we can cross bridges of cultural, economic, and social divisions that have been reinforced on us to do things together. And that change can result in a lack of interpersonal violence. It can result in a lack of harm and a lack of access to basic human needs and qualities. Together, we can do these things. So I just wanted to leave with the idea that we're going to continue to be bombarded with these unfortunate numbers and statistics. It's okay to unplug. It's okay to feel burnt out. It's okay to get angry as all hell or sad as all hell. But don't stop talking about it, and don't stop having the faith that together we can make a difference. And I don't mean that as this is not just a music video. That's just a strategic reality. And that doesn't mean accept the way things are together. But even if it means we've got to tear a whole bunch of shit down and work it back, if we keep focused on doing it together, that change can become a reality. And it's together that we have hope. See how that works? So I want to thank Angelica, Peter, Mary, Chelsea, Vikki, for being such phenomenal panel guests. We hope to have you on for other episodes as well. And I want to thank you who's watching. And if you engage this content at a later date, thank you for supporting the Hope for Us Network. Our mission is proactive prevention education. Thank you, everyone in the comment and chat. Huge shout out to the production team who makes Raising the Visibility possible. Scott, Christina, Ben, your love. Shout out to Aaron. Shout out to everyone who's ever hooked up and helped us out. Marlo, I think you're out there somewhere. Shout out. Kate, what's up? Tomorrow Show people, what's up? Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and you have a wonderful evening. And we'll see you next week.